video 3 on path design, we'll be delving deeper into that fractal pattern and learning how natural orders help shape our garden path design.
What we mean by that is that in these fractal patterns, as they branch out, the branches get continuously smaller. Now, we can use that same idea when we design our garden paths to keep our paths as small as possible while still maintaining all of the access that we need. So we keep major pathways larger and small access pathways as small as possible. And keep in mind we can do this even in an informal garden. It doesn't have to be shaped like a fractal pattern. Even in our garden, our front garden, which is very formal, we have the same pattern. And we see that pattern in historic sorts of gardens from around the world, including these medieval formal gardens that had major access paths and small access pathways. So we'll be referring in this video to this worksheet on paths and orders, in which we're going to match up the orders of paths to different kinds of uses, make recommendations about how wide they should be, and in the next video we'll get into what kind of materials suit each type of path best. So our process will be to develop a site map and set of paths that use these different scales of paths and materials to achieve the best possible effect.
So our first order largest paths are going to be those that connect us to the outside world, that are the major entry points for guests, materials, shipping, and the major exit points for materials off of our site, including our produce. Generally speaking, these have to be large enough to accommodate any of the common vehicles that you're going to be bringing into the site. And they also have to be durable enough. So start thinking now about what kinds of materials you're going to need for that kind of application. We'll get into that more in the following video. Next are our second order paths. Now, on some major sites, especially farms, it becomes very common to get a second tier of major access, largely for farm equipment or shipping trucks, things like this. These usually are smaller than the major site access. You're never going to be pulling in a major truck for this sort of thing. But some of these will also be ephemeral, only used during harvest season, so they have a lot less traffic than those major sites. So this distinction allows us to use the expensive materials that can accommodate the greater traffic and use only where they're needed, and then use less intensive materials on these secondary pathways. So understanding the difference there on large sites becomes really important. Here at Lily House, we don't really have that as a secondary issue. On just, about an acre, we only have the one major access point for our garden, and that works for us. After that, we have our major site, intra-site pathway structures, such as the one I'm actually sitting by right here. Some of our main pathways that take people through our garden and take us to our shed and to the major features of our site. This might include the paths to the barns, major paths that animals travel. Making sure we get those right is important as well. Typically speaking, these only have to be able to accommodate wheelbarrows or perhaps quads, something like this. Typically 4 to 6 feet is nice. It's really nice to be able to space these if you have lawn, which, as we're going to talk about in the next video, is a really appropriate use for these kinds of paths, or material or path type for these kinds of paths. You want to maybe space them to be, double the size of your mower deck, so it only takes 2 courses through, or maybe the size of one pass by if you have a larger deck.
down on the micro level of path design, we see the power of using good design here, where single rows in a 10 by 10 foot path require 40 feet of path. That's 40% of it just going to waste and requiring maintenance. Meanwhile, raised beds only require 10 square feet of path. They've dramatically improve both your productivity and reduce your maintenance time. But if we move instead to this keyhole design, we've really radically reduced our maintenance. So we can build a whole garden out of keyhole structures like that. And we can keep paths small, use little nodes that are larger workspaces, as we'll see in a moment, and design whole gardens around that idea.
And that really gives us the idea of our small access paths in the garden. These we typically try to keep down to a foot and a half, very small, but that gives you another problem, right? You don't have enough room to work in the bed or to put a bucket for harvest, things like this. So it becomes really important to have nodes. So we call that a path and node design. These would be little circular, triangular openings in our paths that may be, more like 3 feet wide. Because they're just small openings, they're a little easier to maintain, yet they still give us the ability to work, to be able to store things, put down our tools, all of that. That becomes very important. To give you an example, there's one actually right behind me, right here. So this is a small path up in between a couple of keyhole design beds. And you can see at the top of that, we have a little opening, a clearance that's a little work node. And it becomes so informal, it's almost difficult to see this time of year especially. But this is such a keyhole bed with 6 keyholes going off into it around a very small inner pathway with woody perennials and perennial vegetables designed in a circle around that major path. This is one of my favorite beds in our entire garden. By creating these circular sort of structures, we can maintain this sort of path and node design. For example, right there, there's a node, and further over to the left, the path goes beyond there, there's another node. And these are all big circles of keyhole beds, just like the mandala garden type design. And because they're circular, they automatically create a set of nodes and paths. So much of the garden can be maintained by this node and path design, whether these become self-mulching or left in lawn, you see a node there. But finally, we have a 5th order of path design that I like to include, which is that sometimes you can have a slightly larger bed if you include little areas of stepping stones, or in this case, sawn logs, you can see down here, and just a few that allow us to step into beds or make our way around in small areas. Because they're infrequently used and in beds, can often become permanent structures and really only need one installation. Alright, so in our next video, we'll get into how to maintain each of these types of orders of paths. That way we can really give you a tool that will help you choose the best path design to be able to maintain it for each of the functions in the garden. This is where I think our path design concept starts to get really powerful and important in helping you maintain the landscape.